right. So just a reminder is that this is on the second half of Unit 2. You have a question?
Yeah, are these posted?
So I'm going to post this video once.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of this is repeat if you've been doing the homework anyway in those videos. So some of this stuff will be just a review of, right? But that's what this is a review. Also, for when I was after school last Tuesday, I made a video of the stuff I was going to go over. So some of that material you want to know for the second half of the quiz also. So make sure you've also seen that one if you haven't. So I'll only spend like 8 minutes and see what we get to. So we'll talk about two things: federal bureaucracy and also the courts. It's not covering all of it, right? The videos, the homeworks goes into more detail, but this is just bringing out some points that you want to know, some main points for the quiz and for the future exam. If you have questions on this, as I go through it, still ask. Don't be afraid because like we're recording it or whatever. All right. So the first part about the bureaucracy, remember the federal bureaucracy, oh, bless you, is often referred to as the fourth branch of government. It's not officially, right? There's no fourth branch of government in our Constitution. This is not what Article 4 is about, right? But it does play an important role with the branches, more specifically the legislative and the executive branch. And it does help get a lot of the work done, ideally. All right. So these are government organizations, and it says it's usually staffed with officials because of their experience and expertise. So if you're in the EPA, which stands for, what's EPA stand for? Yeah, right, the Environmental Protection Agency, right? You don't run for that job, right? People don't elect you to that job. But ideally, you know something about the environment, or maybe just about types of policy, or something that would help the EPA carry out its mission. And their goal is to implement public policy. So you see in that green box, Congress will basically give a mandate, right? They'll either pass laws or they'll create an agency or will say, we want this to happen. But believe it or not, most congressmen or women don't really know the best way to implement these things. They don't necessarily have skills or expertise in these areas. So then the various bureaucratic agencies set the guidelines then. So they get a mandate, like, okay, if it's, decrease, this pollution by this much, well, the EPA, they would be then decide, well, how do you do that? And how will we regulate it? And how will we check it? It's supposed to be nonpartisan, right? So not belonging to a political party. There's been times where Congress will think that it is being partisan, and they might have oversight hearings about it. Or the media might think a branch, a part of the bureaucracy is being partisan, and they'll bring attention to it. But they typically are nonpartisan. Now, there's been some devolution, right? Remember that idea that the federal government sort of gives away some of its power to the states, which is not to say that the federal bureaucracy is not still huge, because it is, but it has sort of passed down some of its powers, if you will, to state and local bureaucracies. So those bureaucracies have actually increased over time. All right. How does bureaucracy, how is it kept accountable? Right? How do we make sure they're not just running wild with the powers given from their mandates? Well, it's mostly held accountable by Congress. POTUS can appoint people to cabinets, right? Executive cabinets are different than bureaucratic things, right? The EPA has a director, not a cabinet secretary, for example, right? But they may fall under some cabinet secretaries. They have a connection there. Congress will also hold committee hearings. They'll have oversight hearings to make sure they're doing things the way they want them to. And of course, Congress controls the budget. So if you give a various bureaucratic agency more money, we can do more. If you take away some of it, right? Maybe you don't think they're doing it right and they don't deserve, or they don't need it, or whatever. The post office, right, is an example of one of those agencies. And I mentioned oversight hearings. They review these agency's activities, right? Make sure, hey, like there was time I can share a link when they thought the post office was being partisan, and there were oversight hearings. This wasn't too long ago, right? That would be an example. So here's some examples. You don't need to memorize all the different bureaucratic agencies. I think it'd be close to impossible. But if you have a question on the AP exam where you had to like list or identify an example, right, you would know that the Defense Department in of itself, right, it falls under the Secretary of Defense, who's been in the news lately. We can talk about that after. But if it's something that sounds like it's not a direct cabinet position, that's usually a good clue. So, for example, the Federal Reserve Board, we'll learn more about them not too long from now. That's an example. Equal employment opportunity, a commission, right? Oh, no, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. My bad. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the EPA, as you mentioned, and NASA, one of my favorite ones. Keep in mind that these agencies are supposed to do things in the public interest, right? It's in our interest to have the EPA or equal employment, right? It's supposed to be in the best interest of the public. All right. So we say here they regulate industries to protect public interest. Here's more examples. The Federal Election Commission, right? We've heard about them a lot in the news the past few years. It is in our best interest that we have free and fair elections, right? So they would supervise that. The CIA, the EPA, the FDA. What does FDA stand for? Excellent. The Food and Drug Administration. So although they do many things, it is in our best interest that they put those, they should call them warning labels, on the side of food, right? That we know how much macros and calories and protein, and that's a macro, but you know what I'm saying, is in there. The National Archives, right? That's been in the news a lot with the whole like classified document issues. Keeping those records are in our best interest as well. Well, you can talk later too about how the FDA was created. If you guys read The Jungle, anyone read that or know about The Jungle? About the meat packing industry and eating meat full of like rat poison, or no? You didn't learn about this in world history? Oh, we have much to talk about. And if you at home, you should learn about it too. All right. So quickly on our court systems, remember which Federalist paper do we read about the court systems that thought it'd actually be the least powerful branch? Remember, 78. There we go, right? And some people were concerned there was no court system under the Articles. Will this be powerful? And Hamilton was like, no, nothing to worry about. Keep in mind also, the court system is supposed to be, you can argue whether they are or not for lots of these points, but they're supposed to be the least responsive to public opinion. And I think if you compare them to the two other branches, you would agree that they are, right? So if people didn't like the Dobbs decision, if they didn't like that Roe v. Wade was returned, their protests are not supposed to influence their decision, right? They're not supposed to, unlike the trustee model, many congressmen think like, oh, we should do what our people, vote how our people want us to vote. That's not the case, right? The courts don't vote how the people want them to vote, or at least, they might, but that's not their reasoning. Okay. Remember appeals courts? You might hear the term appellate court, the same thing. Those are the courts that review previous district court decisions if someone thinks it was done. There are all different appeals courts. The Supreme Court can also be a highest level appeals court. Remember, I think now, I think we learned that Trump appealing the Colorado decision to get him off the ballot, the Supreme Court did say they would hear that appeal. So that will be big news. All right. We've already discussed a lot about precedent, right? That's when they make a decision based on previous decisions that are similar, right? And that's also stare decisis, right? So if you hear that Latin term, that deals with precedent. All right. A lot of questions yesterday about the difference between judicial activism and judicial restraint. And some people were like, well, was it good or bad? That's an opinion, right? I'm not going to say which one is right, which one is bad. Maybe a little bit of both. I don't know. But Judicial activism is a tendency for judges to interpret the Constitution according to their own policy reviews. So how they view, whether they're more maybe liberal or conservative, how they might rule based on what they think is best for society. Right? It might not be like an original interpretation of the court or a textual interpretation of the Constitution. But if they're allowing sort of their views, understanding of society and what would be in the best interest, that decision is made, that's judicial activism. All right? If that is the case and courts become more activist, that is an expansion of court powers, unlike what Hamilton said. Right? So Hamilton really didn't view more of this activist court kind of ordeal. So that is something to keep in perspective. This is the opposite of judicial restraint. Judicial restraint is when you're not really looking at what do you think is best for the people. It's what do you think the Constitution allows. And if you think maybe the Constitution allows for something that you don't actually think is best for the people, you still rule the way the Constitution in your mind would want it, and then sort of hint at, now it's up to Congress to make a law to make it better for the people. You see the difference between activism and restraint? Okay. And we can talk more about that. Keep in mind that in order for any of this to be effective, it needs to be enforced, and it's usually enforced by the executive branch, right? We mentioned, Brown v. Board, you can say you have to desegregate. Who's going to make them desegregate, right? It might take federal troops years later to go in to make you desegregate. So in that way, Hamilton said they're really not that powerful because they can make decisions all they want, but they have to be enforced in order to be effective.
So there's nothing stopping the president from just not enforcing every single thing?
Right. Yeah. So if you say okay, that's a great decision, you don't agree with it, maybe you're not going to enforce it. Now, it's not always up to the president to enforce it. It really depends on what it is, right? But, the courts aren't going to send out an army. They're not going to, they're not going to make the laws if a law is needed to change it or whatever. It's just their ruling. Now, public opinion may then put pressure, right, on the other branches to enforce it, right? But that could go either way. All right, any questions on this? All right, I think I spent more than 10 minutes, so hopefully the people at the assembly will appreciate this.